They told me he was my brother. For 16 years, that was the story. But on his 16th birthday, as I watched my mother hand him the first slice of cake, I saw the truth for what it was. A lie forged in a dark hallway, a secret she helped bury to protect the man who broke me. My brother was my son, and the woman who gave me life had spent every day since then erasing me. What happens when a daughter has nothing left to lose? Stick around, follow our channel, and hit that notification bell, because this is the story of how I clawed my way out of the gilded cage they built for me, one painful truth at a time. My name is Chloe. Today, the air in our small house in Harmony Creek is thick with the scent of sugar and lies. It's my brother Leo's 16th birthday, and my mother, Eleanor, is in her element. She moves through the kitchen, not like a woman preparing for a party, but like a high priestess conducting a sacred ritual. Her voice, a melodic hum of directives, floats over the clatter of china. "Chloe, the silverware needs another polish. I can see a smudge on the forks. And the roses, dear, they need to be perfectly centered. This day has to be perfect for Leo." Perfection. In our house, perfection was a carefully constructed facade, and I was one of the load-bearing walls, invisible but essential to keeping the whole thing from collapsing. I do as I'm told, my movements practiced and silent. I polish the silver until my own reflection is a distorted, ghostly blur. I arrange the flowers, their cloying sweetness a strange contrast to the bitterness coiling in my stomach. Leo, the guest of honor, sits at the head of the dining table, slouched in his chair, scrolling through his phone. He's a prince, bored by the unending parade of tributes. To the world and to himself, he is Leo Walker, the beloved son of my mother's brother, my Uncle David. A handsome, charismatic man whose generosity was the talk of Harmony Creek. A man whose portrait, framed in ornate gold, hangs above the mantelpiece like an icon in a shrine. He is also my son. The thought is not a shock anymore. It's a constant, a dull throb beneath the surface of my life, like a bone that was set wrong and aches with every change in the weather. I was a child when it happened. Now, Leo is almost a man, and the secret is a living, breathing thing that shares our home. It eats at our table and sleeps under our roof. Eleanor carries the cake in from the kitchen. It's a masterpiece, a monument of chocolate and cream she spent 2 full days creating. 2 days of measuring, mixing, and baking. Her face a mask of serene concentration. It's the kind of effort she used to reserve for my birthdays, a long, long time ago. She places it in front of Leo, who barely looks up from his screen. "Make a wish, my darling boy," she coos, her voice dripping with a honeyed affection that has never, not once in 16 years, been directed at me. He blows out the candles in a single indifferent puff of air. A smattering of applause from the few family friends present fills the room. My mother takes the silver cake knife, the one I just polished. The first slice is a large, perfect triangle, thick with layers of ganache and sponge. She places it on a porcelain plate and slides it in front of Leo. "For my handsome man," she says, her smile so wide it looks painful. "You're growing up so fast, just like your father." Her eyes flicker to the mantelpiece, to the smiling face of Uncle David, frozen in time. Then, in a gesture that has become a chilling tradition at every family celebration, she cuts a second, smaller piece. She walks over to the fireplace and places the plate on the mantel, directly in front of the portrait. A silent offering to the family saint. The man who ruined me, the man who is a pillar of the community, a celebrated philanthropist, and a monster who visits me in my dreams. I watch from the corner of the room, standing by the wall like a piece of furniture. The guests murmur their approval. "Such a devoted sister," one of them whispers, meaning my mother's devotion to her brother's memory. They don't see the twisted reality of it. They see a loving family. They see what Eleanor wants them to see. Finally, after everyone else has been served, after the cake has been hacked into and the perfect monument is now a ruin, she gestures to the last piece. It's not really a piece. It's a sliver, a crumbling collection of crumbs and mangled frosting that barely holds together. "Chloe, dear, there's some left for you," she says, not even looking at me, her attention already back on Leo. It's an afterthought. I am an afterthought. I take the plate without a word and retreat to the kitchen. I don't eat it. I stand by the sink, looking out at the manicured lawn, and listen to the sounds of the party. I hear my mother's laughter, a bright tinkling sound that grates on my nerves. I hear her telling a story about Leo's first steps, a story she's told 1,000 times, a story that belongs to me. She stole my memories and gave them to him. A moment later, I look back into the dining room. Leo has a smear of chocolate frosting on his chin. Eleanor leans in, her expression one of pure, undiluted love, and gently wipes it away with a napkin. It's a simple, maternal gesture. It's the same way she used to wipe my chin when I was a little girl, before David, before Leo, before the silence. And in that moment, seeing her love for him, a love that was once mine, I feel the bars of my cage press in. It isn't gilded. There is nothing beautiful about it. It's a crude, ugly thing forged from 16 years of my silence and a lifetime of my mother's betrayal. And for the first time, I don't just feel the weight of it, I feel the urge to break it. The last guest's car pulls away, and a sudden heavy quiet descends upon the house. The remnants of the party, used plates, crumpled napkins, the lingering scent of extinguished candles, feel like artifacts from a forgotten war. The victory was Leo's, the spoils were Eleanor's, and I was the battlefield. Sleep offers no escape. It never does. It's not a refuge. It's a portal to the past, a place where the echoes are louder than any present-day sound. I lie in my bed, the same bed I've had since I was a child, and I listen. I listen for the sound that has haunted my nights for more than half my life. There it is. The faint, rhythmic creak of the floorboards in the hallway. It's not real, I tell myself. It's just the old house settling. But my body doesn't believe me. My heart hammers against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. My skin goes cold. I pull the covers up to my chin, a useless shield against a ghost. The memory isn't a faded photograph. It's a living entity. I'm 10 years old again. I'm pretending to be asleep, my breathing shallow. My eyes squeezed shut so tightly I can see bursts of color against the darkness. The hallway floorboards creak, a slow, deliberate sound. Not my mother's light, hurried footsteps. Not my father's heavy, tired tread from before he left us. This is a different weight, a predator's shuffle. Then comes the scent. It seeps under my door, a vile concoction of stale whiskey and Uncle David's cologne. A cloying, sweet smell that clung to his clothes, his hands, the very air around him. It's the scent of dread. I pray. I pray to a God I'm not sure I believe in. Please let him pass my door. Please let him go to the guest room. Please, please, please. And then I pray for my mother to wake up. I can hear her through the thin wall, the soft sound of her breathing in her own room. Sometimes a cough, or the rustle of sheets as she turns in her sleep. She's right there, a few feet of plaster and wood separating me from my protector, but she never wakes up. Or perhaps she just chooses not to hear. I've spent years wondering which is worse. Was she oblivious, or was she a willing accomplice to the silence that was always his greatest weapon? The doorknob turns, a click that echoes like a gunshot in the still house. The weight of his hand lands on my shoulder, heavy and hot through my thin pajamas. His voice, a greasy, conspiratorial whisper that slithers into my ear. This is our little secret, Chloe. A special secret just for us. It's for the family. To keep us all happy. Family. He twisted the word into something ugly, a justification for his darkness. The true horror wasn't just the violation, the physical pain that I learned to dissociate from, to float above my own body and watch it happen to a girl who looked like me. The true horror was the suffocating, absolute silence that followed, a silence he demanded, and a silence my mother sanctioned with her inaction. The next morning, she would see the way I flinched when he put his arm around me at the breakfast table. She would see the way I avoided his gaze, the way I picked at my food, my appetite gone. She saw it all, and she said nothing. She chose the lie. She chose her brother. These memories aren't just ghosts of a past trauma. They are the architects of my present. They are the masons who built the walls of this house, the foundation of my mother's contempt. They are the reason Leo exists, a beautiful, innocent boy born from an ugly, unforgivable act. He is the living, breathing evidence of the secret, and that is why my mother clings to him with such a fierce, desperate love. In her mind, if she loves him enough, if she protects him ferociously enough, it can somehow wash away the sin. Not his sin, mine. By loving Leo, she is atoning for my mistake. By loving him, she can justify her own silence. She looks at him and sees a legacy, a continuation of her precious brother. She looks at me and sees a reminder of the night she chose to stay asleep. She sees her own guilt, and she hates me for it. I finally push myself out of bed. The floorboards are cold beneath my feet. The house is still, but the echoes are screaming in my head. I can't stay in this room. I can't stay in this house. But there's nowhere else to go. Fueled by a night of torment and 16 years of suppressed rage, I walk out of my room and down the hallway, past the spot where the floorboards always creak, and towards the living room, where I know she will be. The party is over. The house is finally quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence that feels more oppressive than the forced cheerfulness of a few hours ago. I find Eleanor in the living room. A single lamp casts a warm, golden glow on the space, making it look peaceful, serene. A lie, like everything else in this house. She isn't cleaning up or reading. She's standing before the mantelpiece, her back to me, staring up at David's portrait. It's a posture of reverence, of worship. She's communing with her saint. My breath catches in my throat. The sight of her, so still, so devoted to the image of the man who destroyed my childhood, ignites the cold fury that has been simmering within me for years. The echoes from the hallway are still ringing in my ears. The ghost of his whiskey-scented breath is still on my neck. The carefully constructed dam inside me, the one I've been reinforcing daily for 16 years, finally cracks. My voice, when it comes out, is a raw, trembling thing I barely recognize as my own. How can you do it? She doesn't turn around immediately. Her shoulders tense slightly, the only sign she's heard me. Do what, Chloe? It's late. You should be in bed. Her tone is dismissive, weary, as if I'm a bothersome child who has interrupted her prayers. This, I say, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. I gesture vaguely around the room, at the remnants of the party, at the shrine on the mantel. All of it, the party, the cake, worshipping him. The word him hangs in the air between us, heavy and foul. How can you celebrate him and his son while you just erase me, as if I don't even exist? She turns then slowly, and her face is not the soft, maternal mask she wears for the world. It's a mask of cold, hard fury. Her eyes, the same blue as mine, are like chips of ice. You exist, she says, her voice dangerously low. You exist as a constant, ungrateful reminder of your own foolishness. The words are like daggers, each one aimed with precision. Foolishness? I repeat, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping my lips. I was a child. You were a foolish girl who threw herself at a handsome man, she retorts, her voice rising, shedding its pretense of calm. My brother was kind to you. He took you under his wing after your father left. He gave you attention, and you couldn't handle it. You twisted it into something sordid in your own mind. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her revisionist history steals my breath. She has polished this lie for so long that she has actually come to believe it. In her story, David is the victim of a precocious, manipulative girl. I am the villain. He was your uncle, she continues, her voice dripping with venom. And you should be on your knees every day, grateful that we didn't throw you out on the street. You should be grateful that we took your mistake and raised him as our own. We gave him a good name. We gave him a father to be proud of. We gave you a roof over your head and saved you from a life of shame. Saved me? I whisper, the words catching in my throat. You didn't save me. You buried me. You built a prison of silence around me and handed him the key. David is a pillar of this community, she practically shouts, her hand clutching the locket around her neck, a nervous habit. He was a good man, a generous man. And Leo is his legacy, A fine, strong boy who will carry on his name. That is what matters. The family name. The family's reputation. She takes a step closer, her face contorted with a righteous anger that is terrifying to behold. She is defending her entire world, the carefully constructed reality she has built on my pain. You will accept this, she hisses, her finger jabbing the air between us. You will continue to be a dutiful daughter. You will be a silent sister to Leo. You will smile at the parties, you will polish the silver, and you will hold your tongue. That is the price of you staying in this house. That is the price of you being allowed to be near Leo. She pauses, letting the weight of her threat sink in. It's the one she's held over my head for years, the ace up her sleeve. Or, she says, her voice dropping back to a chilling, deliberate calm, you will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back, and you will never, ever see Leo again. I will make sure of it. I will tell him you ran away. I will tell him you never loved him. I will erase you completely. Do you understand me? I stare at her, at this woman who is my mother. And in that moment, as her ultimatum hangs in the silent room, something inside me doesn't just crack. It snaps. It's not a violent, explosive break. It's a quiet, clean severance, a single critical wire being cut. The buzzing anxiety that has been my lifelong companion vanishes. The gnawing fear of her disapproval, the desperate, childish hope for a crumb of her affection, it all just evaporates. It's replaced by a terrifying, profound clarity. A calmness so absolute it feels like the eye of a hurricane. She thinks she's threatening me with my greatest fear, but she's years too late. I look at her, really look at her, and I see the truth. I have already lost everything. My childhood was stolen in a dark hallway. My body was made a crime scene. My mother's love, if it ever truly existed, died the first night she chose not to hear my silent screams. And my son, he was never mine to begin with. He was given another mother, another father, another history. I am a ghost in his life, a sister-shaped shadow he barely notices. They have already taken it all. My past, my present, my son. There is nothing left for them to take away. A person with nothing to lose has no more chains. A person with nothing to lose is a person who is finally, utterly free. Free to act. A faint, strange smile touches my lips. Eleanor sees it, and her own face falters, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. She expected tears, pleading, submission. She doesn't understand this new, unnerving stillness. She doesn't understand that she just handed her prisoner the key to her own cell. She just told me the price of silence, and I've decided I'm no longer willing to pay it. The air in the attic was thick, a physical weight of dust and decades of disuse. It smelled of dried-out wood, brittle paper, and the ghosts of mothballs. Eleanor had sent me up here as a punishment, a banishment. Go clean the attic, she'd said, her voice clipped and cold, the words a dismissal. And don't come down until you've made yourself useful. Out of sight, out of mind. That was the foundational rule of our family. I was the living, breathing proof of a truth she wanted to bury, so she sent me here, to the family mausoleum, to be among the other buried things. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the single shaft of light from a grimy dormer window. Old furniture stood shrouded in white sheets, resembling a congregation of silent, hunched figures. Stacks of forgotten magazines slumped against a wall, their covers faded promises of a world that no longer existed. It was a tomb, but for the first time, it didn't feel threatening. The silence up here was different from the silence downstairs. This silence was honest. It didn't pretend to be peace. My task was vague, meaningless. Clean. I ran a finger along the top of a steamer trunk, leaving a pale trail in the gray film. There was no real expectation of progress, only of my absence. So I wandered. I drifted between the spectral shapes, my footsteps soft on the creaking floorboards. I was an archaeologist of my own forgotten history. Here was a box of my old school projects, the glitter and macaroni still stubbornly clinging to construction paper. Here was a rocking horse with one eye, its painted smile now a macabre grimace, pieces of a life I barely recognized as my own. Then I saw it, tucked away under the eaves, almost hidden behind a stack of warped hat boxes. My grandmother's trunk. It was smaller than the others, made of dark cedar wood, bound with tarnished brass straps. My grandmother, Clara, had been a quiet presence in my early life. A woman of gentle hands and sad, knowing eyes. She'd passed away when I was 10, before the worst of the shadows had fully fallen. Eleanor rarely spoke of her, dismissing her as a simple, sentimental woman. But I remembered her differently. I remembered the way her eyes would follow David whenever he entered a room, a subtle tightening around her mouth that no one else seemed to notice. She saw him. She always saw him. A wave of something, nostalgia, grief, a desperate need for connection, washed over me. I knelt and fumbled with the stiff latch. It clicked open with a sound like a sigh. The scent that rose from within was of lavender and old linen. It was her. For a moment I was 5 years old again, bearing my face in her apron. Inside, things were neatly folded. A wedding dress, yellowed to the color of old cream, a baby blanket, knitted with a loving, uneven stitch. And nestled in a small, velvet-lined box were her modest treasures, a string of pearls, a pair of cameo earrings, and her locket. It was silver, tarnished with age, etched with a delicate pattern of ivy. It was the locket she always wore. I'd always assumed it held a miniature portrait of my grandfather. My fingers, clumsy with anticipation, worked at the tiny clasp. It sprang open, but there was no photograph. No smiling, handsome face of the man she had loved. Instead, tucked into the shallow well where a picture should have been, was a tiny, meticulously folded piece of paper. It was brittle, and my hands trembled as I carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It wasn't a name. It was two things. First, a key. Small and made of brass, dulled by time. It looked like a key for a music box or a diary. Attached to its head, with a thin piece of thread, was the second item, the paper itself. On it, in my grandmother's spidery, elegant handwriting, was an address. A bank, not in our town, but in the next county over. And below the address, a number. Safety Deposit Box 4117. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me from my fingertips to my spine. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't sentiment. This wasn't a keepsake. This was a message, a secret. My quiet, gentle grandmother, the woman who always seemed to see the darkness in David's eyes, who had suffered in her own silence, had left something behind. She had buried a weapon and left me a map. A sudden, fierce wave of love for her, so strong it felt like a physical blow, struck me. She hadn't been simple. She had been waiting. And she had left this for me. The dust in the air no longer felt suffocating. It felt like history, waiting to be disturbed. The attic was no longer a tomb. It was an armory. The bus ride to Crestwood felt like traveling to a foreign country. The familiar landmarks of my town gave way to rolling fields and then to the unfamiliar grid of another town's streets. The air itself seemed different, thinner, holding fewer secrets. I clutched my purse, the locket tucked safely inside a zipped compartment. The small, cold weight of the key inside it was a constant reminder of my purpose. It felt both impossibly heavy and like the only thing keeping me anchored. The Crestwood National Bank was an imposing building of granite and glass, designed to project an aura of permanence and impenetrable security. It was the kind of place where David would feel at home, a temple to money and influence. Inside, the air was chilled and silent, smelling of clean paper and quiet power. My worn jeans and simple t-shirt felt glaringly out of place among the crisp suits and polite, hushed tones. A woman with a helmet of perfectly sprayed hair directed me to a polished mahogany desk with a small brass plaque that read, "Mr. Henderson, Branch Manager." Mr. Henderson was exactly as I'd imagined a golfing buddy of my uncle would be. He was a man in his late 50s, with a soft, pinkish face, a stomach that strained against his starched white shirt, and the easy, condescending smile of someone who had never been told no. He looked up from his paperwork, his eyes skimming over me with a flicker of polite disinterest that quickly sharpened into suspicion. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone implying he very much doubted it. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Yes, I'm here to access a safety deposit box. Number 417. I slid the small folded paper with my grandmother's handwriting across the desk. He picked it up, holding it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. He glanced at it, then back at me. The polite mask slipped, revealing a face of practiced obstruction. Box 417, he repeated slowly, drawing out the words. That's a very old account. It's been dormant for a very long time, more than a decade. It belonged to my grandmother, Clara Miller, I said, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I'm her next of kin. He leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, deliberate movement designed to intimidate. He steepled his fingers under his chin. Is that so? Well, Miss Blackwood, I said. Chloe Blackwood. His eyes narrowed slightly at the name, a flicker of recognition. Blackwood. Any relation to Eleanor and David Blackwood? Eleanor is my mother. David is my uncle. The words tasted like ash. A knowing, unpleasant smile touched his lips. I see. Well, Miss Blackwood, this is highly irregular. For an account that has been dormant this long, especially with the original holder deceased, there are procedures. Strict procedures. He started ticking points off on his plump fingers. We'll need an original death certificate for Mrs. Miller, a probated will, letters of administration from the court, proof of inheritance, legally certified. The process can take weeks, even months. You understand? He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded pleased. I understood perfectly. He was building a wall, a fortress of bureaucracy, brick by tedious brick. And behind that wall, he was going to pick up the phone and call his good friend David, the concerned banker reporting a strange girl trying to pry into old family secrets. David would shut this down so fast, so completely, that box would remain sealed for another 100 years. I had to get into that vault. Today, my mind raced, scrambling for a foothold. Panic was a cold tide rising in my chest. Then, a memory surfaced. A fragment of conversation from years ago, overheard from the kitchen. My grandmother talking to my mother. That Mr. Henderson at the bank, such a fussy man, thinks he's a Rockefeller, but all he really cares about are his silly little stamps. Silly little stamps. It was a long shot, a wild, desperate gamble, but it was the only shot I had. I understand, Mr. Henderson, I said, forcing a note of weary resignation into my voice. I gathered the paper from his desk. I'm sorry to have wasted your time. It's just that my grandmother was very specific. She left me a few of her things, and she said to bring this to you. I let my voice crack just a little. I guess I got my hopes up. I turned to leave, letting my shoulders slump. I made it 3 steps before his voice stopped me. Wait. I turned back. His curiosity had been piqued. Greed and curiosity, the 2 great levers of human nature. What things did she leave you? He asked, a new, sharper interest in his eyes. The next morning, I returned to the Crestwood National Bank. This time, I wasn't carrying just my purse. I was carrying a heavy, dust-covered stamp album. It had been my grandfather's, another relic from the attic. I had spent half the night carefully going through it, my only guide being a few frantic searches on the library computer. Mr. Henderson was with a client, so I waited, the album heavy on my lap. My hands were sweating. This was a performance, and my entire future depended on my ability to sell it. When he was finally free, he beckoned me over to his desk, his expression impatient. You again? Miss Blackwood? I believe I was quite clear yesterday. I know, sir, and I'm so sorry to bother you, I began, my voice pitched to sound earnest and a little naive. It's just, you asked what my grandmother left me. Well, it was mostly just sentimental things. But there was this, my grandfather's old stamp collection. My grandmother said it was valuable, but I don't know the first thing about it. I was hoping, since you're a man who understands these things, you might be able to tell me if it's worth anything at all. I wouldn't know who else to ask. I pushed the heavy album across the desk, a humble offering to his ego. His eyes lit up. It was a subtle shift, a glint of the collector's obsession behind the banker's placid facade. He tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but his fingers twitched. "Well, I'm not an appraiser," he said, already pulling the album closer. "But I suppose I could take a quick look." He opened the book. The first few pages were common issues, and he flipped through them dismissively. I held my breath. I had placed the bait carefully. He turned a page, and then he stopped. His breath hitched. It was a single stamp, an inverted Jenny misprint I'd found online, one of the most famous and rarest stamps in the world. Of course, this one wasn't real. It was a high-quality replica I had printed and aged with a tea bag and a bit of careful scuffing, but to a greedy provincial man whose knowledge probably outstripped his access to the real thing, it was a thunderbolt. "My word," he whispered, his face flushing. He pulled a magnifying glass from his desk drawer, his hand shaking slightly as he held it over the stamp. For a long, silent minute, he just stared, completely captivated, his professional caution utterly obliterated by avarice. The world outside of that small, colorful square of paper ceased to exist for him. This was my moment. While his attention was wholly consumed, I reached into my purse. "You know," I said, my voice trembling slightly, as if with a sudden realization. "I'm so flustered, I completely forgot. I found this paper tucked inside the album." "It looks official." I didn't know what to make of it. From my bag, I pulled out a document. It wasn't something I'd found. It was something my grandmother had created. I'd found it tucked in a side pocket of her trunk, a pristine, notarized-looking document, a deed of trust and gift. It was a work of art, complete with an embossed seal that looked impressively official and a signature that looked suspiciously like a lawyer's. It named me, Chloe Blackwood, as the sole and immediate beneficiary of all properties and accounts held in trust by Clara Miller, to be accessed upon presentation of the document itself. It was a brilliant, audacious forgery, a key made of paper to unlock a door made of steel. I placed it on the corner of his desk, just in his peripheral vision. He glanced at it, his eyes still dazed from the stamp. He saw the seal, the legalistic language. He saw a quick, easy way to give me what I wanted, get me out of his hair, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to get his hands on that stamp collection. His greed was now at war with his loyalty to David, and greed was winning by a landslide. He cleared his throat, pushing the stamp album aside, though his hand rested on it possessively. "Ah, yes. Well, this does change things." He picked up the document, giving it a cursory, distracted glance. The potential value of that little stamp had short-circuited his brain. A direct deed of trust. Yes, this bypasses the need for probate. It's all in order. He didn't even check the notary. He didn't call a legal department. He stood up. "Follow me, Miss Blackwood." The sound of the vault door swinging open was like a deep metallic exhalation. It was happening. The air that flowed out was cool and dry, smelling of nothing but metal and time. He led me down a narrow aisle, the clack of his shoes echoing off the walls. He stopped in front of a small, gleaming drawer. "Number 417. He inserted his key, then gestured for me to use mine. The tarnished brass key slid into the lock. It felt like I was inserting it into the heart of the past. I turned it. With a soft, satisfying click, the lock disengaged. Mr. Henderson pulled out a long, narrow metal box and placed it on a small, private viewing table. "Take all the time you need," he said, his eyes flicking again toward the album I'd left on his desk. He backed away, giving me a semblance of privacy, but I knew he was just waiting for his prize. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely lift the lid. Inside, the box was lined with faded black velvet. And on the velvet lay two things. The first was money, bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in paper bands. I didn't count it, but there were thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Enough. It was a lifeline, a tangible resource, the seed money for a war. But the second item was the real weapon. And it was a thick, leather-bound diary, its cover worn smooth with handling. There was no lock. I opened it to the first page. The same elegant, spidery handwriting. My private ledger. The first entry began. Not of accounts, but of sins. Not my sins, but his. It was my grandmother's journal. I sank into the small chair, the cold metal of the box pressing against my ribs, and I began to read. Page after page, year after year, she had documented him. It started with a feeling, a mother's intuition. She wrote about her growing fear of her own son, David, about the cruelty she saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way he'd pull the wings off insects, the cold, flat smile he gave when other children cried. Then the entries grew darker. She wrote about an incident years before I was born, years before my own violation. It involved a young cousin, Amelia, who had come to stay for the summer. The entries were sparse at first, observations of David's strange, possessive attention towards the girl. Then, one night, a sound, a muffled cry from the guest room. My grandmother wrote that she had frozen in her bed, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like ice in her veins. She had done nothing. The next day, Amelia was silent, her eyes hollow. Within a week, she was sent away, back to her parents, with a vague explanation about being homesick and unwell. She was never spoken of again. I was a coward, my grandmother wrote, the words bleeding shame and regret onto the page. I chose silence, and my silence was a stone that I have carried in my heart ever since. I will not make that mistake again. That night marked a turning point. Consumed by guilt, she had started a secret war. She couldn't confront him, not in a family that worshipped him, but she could watch him. She could listen. She became a spy in her own home. She meticulously, painstakingly documented everything, his business deals, the ones he boasted about at dinner. She noted the names of companies, the dates of transactions. She followed the trail of his shady construction business, noting the inflated invoices for public works projects, the names of shell corporations registered in faraway places, the flow of money that was clearly being washed clean through legitimate channels. She had built a case, a detailed, damning indictment she never got to use. She hadn't just been a quiet old woman knitting in a corner. She had been a spy master. She had been a general, planning a campaign from the shadows. And she had left her entire war chest to me. The cash was the logistics. This diary was the bomb. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. The grief and fear that had been my constant companions for years began to recede, replaced by something else. Something solid and heavy and powerful. Purpose. I closed the diary, placed it and the bundles of cash into my purse, and walked out of the vault, leaving the empty metal box behind. Mr. Henderson was waiting for me, his eyes gleaming. "All taken care of?" he asked, his gaze fixed on my bag. "Yes," I said, my voice even. I walked to his desk and picked up the stamp album. "Thank you so much for your help, Mr. Henderson. I think I'll hold on to this. For sentimental reasons." The look of pure, unadulterated fury on his face was the first small taste of victory. It was delicious. The diary was a map, but it was written in a language I didn't fully understand, the language of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and legal loopholes. I had the ammunition, but I didn't know how to build the gun, let alone aim it. But my grandmother, my brilliant, methodical grandmother, had left me one more clue. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the diary was a business card, yellowed with age. Arthur Harrison, attorney at law. Below the name she had written a short note. "A good man. He can be trusted." A few phone calls and a search of public records revealed that Arthur Harrison had retired over 15 years ago. He was no longer in the city. He lived in a small cottage in a town called Oak Haven, 2 towns over, a sleepy place known for its antique shops and quiet streets. Hope, fragile but fierce, spurred me onward. Oak Haven was the antithesis of my family's world. The houses were small and well-tended, with overflowing flower boxes and welcoming front porches. Arthur Harrison's cottage was at the end of a quiet lane, a charming stone building nearly swallowed by an explosion of climbing roses. The air smelled of blossoms and damp earth. I found him in the front garden, kneeling on a foam pad, carefully tending to his rose bushes. He was a frail-looking man, perhaps in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and skin as thin and translucent as parchment. But when he looked up at the sound of my footsteps on the gravel path, his eyes were anything but frail. They were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a bit raspy from disuse. He looked at me, a teenager standing nervously at his gate with a gentle, questioning curiosity. "Mr. Harrison? Mr. Arthur Harrison?" I asked, my voice small. "That's me," he said, slowly getting to his feet with a slight wince, brushing dirt from the knees of his trousers. Or what's left of him. "My name is Chloe Blackwood. My grandmother was Clara Miller. She was a client of yours, a long time ago." At the mention of her name, his expression changed. The gentle curiosity was replaced by a guarded watchfulness. A shadow of the past seemed to cross his face. "Clara Miller," he said, the name a memory on his tongue. "Yes."
"A fine woman. That was a very long time ago. What can I do for her granddaughter?" My carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. The words just came tumbling out, a torrent of truth I had held back for a lifetime. I told him everything. About Leo, about David, about my mother's suffocating silence, about the locket, the bank, and the diary. My voice was raw, breaking at times, but I didn't stop. I had to make him understand. He listened patiently, his sharp eyes never leaving my face. He didn't interrupt. He didn't show shock or disbelief. He just listened, his expression unreadable, as if he were assembling pieces of a puzzle he already knew the shape of. When I was finally done, the silence in the garden felt profound. The only sounds were the buzzing of bees and the distant chime of a wind harp. "That's quite a story, young lady," he said finally, his voice soft. He seemed weary, the weight of his years settling back onto his shoulders.
"David. I remember him as a boy, arrogant, with a streak of cruelty his mother couldn't bear to see." He sighed, a deep, tired sound. "I'm retired, Miss Blackwood. My days in the courtroom, my days of fighting these kinds of battles, they're long over. I'm afraid I can't help you." My heart sank. He was my last hope. The carefully constructed purpose I had felt in the bank vault began to crumble. "But she said you were a good man," I pleaded, my voice desperate. "She said you could be trusted." I opened my bag and took out the diary. I opened it to a specific page I had marked, one where she mentioned him by name. "Met with Arthur today about updating my will. A good man. He sees the world for what it is." I almost told him about David, but my courage failed me. I fear what my son is capable of, and I fear putting a good man in his path. I held the diary out to him. He took it, his long, thin fingers tracing her handwriting.
He read the passage, then another, and another. I watched as a slow transformation took place. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else: anger, regret, a spark of the fire he must have once possessed. He looked from the diary to me, and for the first time, I think he truly saw me. Not just as a troubled girl, but as the inheritor of Clara's fight. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice no longer raspy but firm, resonating with a long, dormant authority. "Your grandmother was a formidable woman, wiser than any of us knew." He closed the diary and handed it back to me. "She was right. I am a good man. And a good man doesn't stand by and let monsters win, not if he can help it." He looked at his rose bushes, then back at me, a decision solidifying in his gaze. "She knew justice often needs a helping hand. Very well, Chloe, I will help you. I can't be your lawyer in a courtroom, but I can be your guide through this maze. Show me everything you have. And we'll build a case David Blackwood can't escape." I finally had an ally. The war had officially begun. The first thing we did with the money from the box, a gift from Arthur as he called it, was not to hire investigators or file lawsuits. It was to start a garden. To Eleanor, this new development was a source of immense relief and satisfaction. She saw me, her difficult, sullen, inconvenient daughter, finally embracing a calm, womanly hobby. She watched from the kitchen window as I spent hours in the backyard, tilling the neglected patch of earth behind the garage. She saw me poring over books, ordering seeds, my hands covered in dirt. She thought it was a sign of submission, of my spirit finally breaking. She thought I was planting roots, settling into the quiet, decorative life she'd always wanted for me. "It's so good to see you doing something constructive, Chloe," she said one afternoon, her voice laced with that cloying, patronizing approval I despised. "A garden teaches patience. It's a gentle thing." She was wrong. My garden was an act of silent, patient warfare, and there was nothing gentle about it. The books I studied weren't from the local nursery. They were old, leather-bound botany texts that had also been in my grandmother's trunk, tucked away with her diary. Their pages were filled with detailed anatomical drawings of plants and notes in the margins, written in her familiar, elegant script. Eleanor didn't recognize the names on the seed packets I ordered online using a prepaid card. She saw me planting flowers, and in a way, they were beautiful. Deceptively so. I was not growing daisies. Near the back fence, where the shadows were longest, I planted aconite, with its hooded purple-blue flowers, also known as wolfsbane. In a sunnier patch, I cultivated a row of oleander, its glossy green leaves and delicate pink blossoms hiding a potent toxin that could induce confusion and cardiac distress. I tended a thriving bush of belladonna, its unassuming black berries gleaming like drops of night. Atropa belladonna, the beautiful lady, whose poison could erase inhibitions and create vivid hallucinations. And in a special, carefully prepared bed, I grew datura, the devil's trumpet, with its huge, ethereal white flowers that opened only at night, their scent intoxicating, their seeds a source of delirium and suggestibility. This was my poison garden, my quiet arsenal. Arthur, on our weekly clandestine meetings at a quiet cafe halfway between our towns, was initially horrified by this part of my plan. "Chloe, this is incredibly dangerous," he had warned, his face pale. "This is not justice. This is something else." "Justice is a word powerful people use to protect themselves," I told him, my voice steady. "David is protected by lawyers, by money, by my mother's denial. The law can't touch his mind. It can't touch the sickness inside him. But I can." I explained my methodology, born from hours of research in my grandmother's books and cross-referenced with modern pharmacological texts from the library. "I'm not trying to kill them, Arthur. I'm a gardener, not a murderer. The doses will be microscopic, precise, not lethal, psychological, designed to peel back the layers of control, to loosen the tongue, to amplify the paranoia that already lives inside them. My revenge won't be a loud explosion. It will be a quiet, creeping vine that dismantles their minds before it dismantles their lives." He was a man of the law, of black and white rules. He struggled with it. But he also looked at the evidence in the diary, at the cold, legal truth of what my uncle was, and he saw the limitations of his world. Reluctantly, he conceded, focusing his own efforts on the financial front. So my days took on a strange, bifurcated rhythm. By day, I was the dutiful, gardening daughter, my hands in the soil, nurturing my beautiful, deadly blossoms. By night, I was a student of toxicology, carefully drying leaves, grinding seeds, measuring powders on a tiny digital scale I'd bought with the cash. I was learning to prepare them, to create infusions and tinctures that were odorless, tasteless. I was creating tools. The garden grew, lush and vibrant. It became a thing of beauty, a point of pride for Eleanor. She would bring her friends out to the patio to admire it. "Isn't it lovely?" she would say. "Chloe has such a gift." And I would stand there, smiling meekly, my hands stained with earth, looking at my beautiful flowers and thinking of the exquisite chaos they would one day unleash. While my garden grew, Arthur and I worked on untangling the financial web my grandmother had started to map. It was even more complex and corrupt than she had realized. David's construction company wasn't just skimming off the top. It was a massive, sophisticated front for a money laundering operation. He would win bids for town projects, a new library wing, a repaved road, at wildly inflated prices, thanks to his connections on the town council. He would then subcontract the work to a series of shell corporations he owned, companies that existed only on paper, registered in places like the Cayman Islands and Panama. The money would be funneled through these offshore accounts, emerging clean on the other side, while the actual work was done on the cheap, using substandard materials. He wasn't just a predator, he was a parasite, bleeding his own community dry. The diary gave us the blueprint. The cash from the box gave us the resources to dig deeper. Arthur, using his old contacts and a healthy dose of my seed money for private database access, began to pull on the threads. We obtained bank statements, incorporation documents, and blueprints that showed the stark, criminal difference between what was promised and what was built. We had a mountain of evidence, but Arthur's legal mind knew a direct assault was risky. David was a pillar of the community, a master of manipulation. He would bury us in legal motions, paint me as a hysterical, vengeful girl, and use his influence to crush us. "We can't just drop this on the authorities," Arthur explained, stirring his tea in our usual booth at the cafe. "David's roots in that town run too deep. The chief of police plays golf with him. The district attorney attends his Christmas parties. They will move slowly, give him time to cover his tracks. We need to create a firestorm he can't control. We need to turn public opinion against him before the first legal document is ever filed." His strategy was brilliant. We wouldn't be the accusers. We would let someone else do the work for us. My part of the plan required a different kind of precision. I went to the public library in a town 3 counties away. Using their public computer, I created a new anonymous email address. Something untraceable. Ghost in the Machine 117. Then, I began my research, not into finances, but into journalists. I needed someone specific, not an old, established reporter who might be friends with David or have a cozy relationship with the town's power brokers. I needed someone young, hungry, ambitious, and maybe a little bit reckless. Someone who was trying to make a name for herself and wasn't afraid to take on a giant. I found her at the regional paper, the Tri-County Sentinel. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. She was in her late 20s, and for the past year, she had been writing sharp, insightful investigative pieces. She'd exposed a slumlord in a neighboring town and uncovered a kickback scheme in the county assessor's office. Her articles were meticulously researched and written with a quiet, righteous anger. She was perfect. The first email was short. Subject: a crack in the foundation of Blackwood construction. To S. Jenkins at Tri-County Sentinel. Com. From Ghost in the Machine 117 at proton.me. Miss Bond Jenkins. You don't know me, you never will. But you are a journalist who seems to care about the truth. The people of my town see David Blackwood as a benefactor, a philanthropist. They are wrong. Look into the public works contract for the Northgate Bridge renovation from 2 years ago. Compare the approved budget with the materials cost sheet from the supplier, a copy of which you will find attached. Ask yourself where the extra $2 million went. This is just one small crack. The entire foundation is rotten. I attached a single document. A damning invoice showing David's company billing the town for high-grade steel while the supplier's sheet showed they had purchased cheaper, substandard rebar. It was a single, undeniable piece of the puzzle. I didn't give her the whole story. I followed Arthur's advice. Just give her crumbs, he'd said. Enough to make her hungry. Enough to make her start digging on her own. I hit send. For a week, there was nothing. I obsessively checked the paper's website, my stomach twisting into knots. Maybe she'd dismissed it as a crank email. Maybe she was scared. Maybe I'd picked the wrong person. Then, one Tuesday, it appeared. A small article buried on page B4. The headline was cautious. Questions raised over Northgate Bridge budget. It didn't mention David by name, not directly. It just talked about discrepancies in the public record and quoted an anonymous source. But it was there. The first stone had been thrown. A week later, I sent another email. This time, I attached a bank statement from one of the shell corporations, showing a large deposit that corresponded with the missing funds from the bridge project. Subject: follow the money. Keep digging, Miss Jenkins. You're closer than you think. The next article was on the front page. Sarah Jenkins was now on the scent. The pressure was building from the outside, a storm gathering on the horizon, and no one in my family, least of all my uncle, the town's beloved benefactor, had any idea that I was the one seeding the clouds. He was being investigated, his name whispered about in town hall, and all he saw when he looked at me was a quiet girl tending her pretty little garden. The scent of money, old and new, clung to the air, a cloying perfume of roasted duck, expensive cologne, and my mother's desperate ambition. Tonight, the house was not a home. It was a stage, every polished surface reflecting a carefully constructed lie. David, my uncle, my abuser, the father of my son, had secured the contract to build the new town hall. It was the keystone in the arch of his fraudulent empire, and Eleanor, my mother, was celebrating his coronation. She drifted through the dining room, a frantic ghost in silk, adjusting a silver fork by a millimeter, straightening a wine glass that was already perfectly aligned. Her eyes, usually dull with a practiced indifference towards me, now shone with a feverish pride. She was the architect of this evening, a general marshalling her forces for a victory parade. The forces were David's key business partners, their wives dripping in quiet jewelry, and 2 members of the town council, men with soft hands and pliable morals. "Chloe!" she called, her voice sharp, cutting through the low hum of the oven. I appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, wearing the plain black dress and white apron she'd laid out for me, my uniform. "The canapes. I want them ready the moment the Hendersons arrive. Don't burn the crostini this time. And for heaven's sake, try to look pleasant. You are a part of this family, even if you insist on acting like a storm cloud." I nodded, my face a blank canvas. I am a part of this family. The words echoed in the silent chambers of my mind. I was the secret, the shame, the foundation of their carefully balanced world, and tonight, I was going to be the earthquake that brought it all down. She saw my silence as sullen compliance. She didn't see the calm, the chilling serenity that had settled over me in the past few weeks. She didn't realize she was handing a lit match to the girl she'd spent a lifetime soaking in gasoline. She wanted me to serve. She wanted me to be a witness on the sidelines of their triumph. She had no idea that I was not the witness. I was the director. I returned to the kitchen, the heart of the house, where the heat was a physical presence. My own preparations had been made long before the first vegetable was chopped for the evening's feast. An hour before the house began to swell with the forced laughter of important guests, I had engaged in my own quiet ritual. My garden, my sanctuary of silent, potent life, had offered up its bitter gifts. Oleander, belladonna, foxglove, names that sounded like poetry and carried the weight of judgment. I had studied them with the devotion of a scholar, learning their secrets, their precise language. Arthur had helped me find the old toxicology books, texts that spoke not of endings, but of alterations, of unraveling. From the dried leaves and petals, I had brewed a tea, a calming herbal blend, I would call it. The steam rose from the delicate porcelain pot, carrying a faint, earthy scent, easily masked by the stronger notes of mint and chamomile I'd added. It was a potion not of death, but of truth, a key designed to unlock the rusted gates of self-control, to let the paranoid beasts caged within their minds run free. The house was a hive of nervous energy. My mother was in her bedroom, fanning herself as she fretted over her speech. I knocked softly on her open door. "I brought you something," I said, my voice gentle. "A calming tea, to help with your nerves." She glanced at me, distracted, then at the steaming cup. "Oh, how thoughtful, Chloe, for once." She took it without suspicion, her mind already at the dinner table, accepting compliments. "Just put it on the vanity. Make sure Leo stays in his room once the guests arrive. I don't want him underfoot." "Of course," I said, watching as she took a long sip. She closed her eyes for a moment. "It's pleasant. One down." I found David in his study, the room where he cultivated his persona as a pillar of the community. He was rehearsing his speech in front of a mirror, his voice booming with false sincerity. He was a man in love with the sound of his own lies. A glass of amber liquor sat on his desk, untouched. Tonight, he needed a clear head for his performance. "Uncle David?" I said from the doorway. He turned, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at the interruption. "I brought you something, for your throat. It's a special blend my grandmother used to make.
It helps with clarity of voice. The mention of our grandmother, his mother, was a calculated touch. It connected the act to a legacy he and Eleanor had twisted for their own purposes, a legacy of feigned propriety. He looked at the cup, his ego pricked. Of course he needed to be in fine voice. The whole town, or at least the part of it that mattered, would be hanging on his every word. "Good girl, Chloe," he said, the praise like gravel in my ears. He took the cup and drank half of it down in one go, the way he did everything, with an impatient, entitled thirst. "That's not bad. Now run along. Big night." He turned back to the mirror, and I watched him for a moment longer. I watched the poison slide into the serpent's mouth, a quiet promise delivered in a porcelain cup. I retreated to the kitchen, my heart a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. The trap was set. The actors had taken their places. The stage was lit. All I had to do now was serve the first course and wait for the curtain to rise on the final act. The doorbell chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that signaled the beginning of the end. I picked up the silver tray of canapés, my reflection warped and distant on its polished surface. I smoothed my apron, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked out of the kitchen to greet their guests with a pleasant, vacant smile.
The dining room hummed with the electric current of performance. Crystal glasses chimed, a counterpoint to the low murmur of conversation. I moved through the room like a shadow, a silent attendant to their hollow charade. I refilled wine glasses, offered bread, and cleared plates, my movements economical and silent. My presence was so seamlessly integrated into the background that they barely registered me as human. I was a function, a pair of hands. This invisibility was my greatest asset. Mr. Henderson, the councilman with a weak chin and an insatiable appetite for flattery, was laughing too loudly at one of David's anecdotes. "Incredible, David, simply incredible. The vision you have for this town. It's a new era." "We're just getting started, Robert," David said, his voice a low, confident rumble. But I saw it. A slight tremor in the hand that held his wine glass, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple, despite the cool air of the room. He was holding court, but the throne felt unsteady beneath him. His eyes, usually so focused and predatory, kept darting towards the windows, as if expecting an unseen threat. The paranoia was a tiny seed, just beginning to sprout in the fertile soil of his guilt. My mother was a butterfly, flitting from guest to guest, her laughter a high, brittle tinkling. "Oh, David has always been the rock of this family," she chirped to Mrs. Davies, the partner's wife, whose eyes missed nothing. "Ever since our dear father passed, he's taken care of everything, of everyone." She patted her chest, a gesture of feigned modesty that I knew was a symptom of a racing heart. The tea was working on her too, fraying the edges of her formidable composure, making her more effusive, more desperate to sell the story. I served the main course, duck à l'orange, its rich sauce a vibrant slash of color on the pristine white plates. As I placed a plate in front of David, our eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was a flicker of confusion in his, a momentary lapse in the performance. He looked at me, truly looked at me, and for an instant, I think he saw not the sullen niece, but something else, an equation he couldn't solve. Then he blinked, and the mask of the benevolent patriarch slid back into place. Leo was upstairs in his room, the low thrum of a video game audible whenever a lull fell over the conversation. My mother had forbidden him from coming down, but I knew he could hear us. He was a part of this, whether he knew it or not. The prize and the proof of my long-kept secret. Finally, the moment arrived. The dessert plates were cleared, and coffee was served. David stood, tapping his glass for attention. The room fell silent, expectant. He held his wineglass aloft, a king addressing his court. "My friends, my partners," he began, his voice imbued with a carefully rehearsed warmth. "Tonight is not just about a contract. It's not just about a building of brick and mortar." He paused for dramatic effect. "It's about building a future. It's about a commitment to the values that make this town great. Integrity, hard work, and above all, community." He seemed off. The word integrity was slightly slurred, the bravado laced with a frantic, almost manic edge. His smile was too wide, a rictus of confidence. "They say a man's legacy is the home he builds," he continued, his gaze sweeping the room, but not quite landing on anyone. "But I say it's the family he protects, the community he serves. I've always strived to be a man of my word, a man you can trust, a man who takes care of his own, no matter the cost." His eyes found my mother's, and she looked back at him with an expression of pure adoration, her face flushed. "And I couldn't have done any of this without the unwavering support of my sister Eleanor, who has stood by me through thick and thin." He raised his glass higher. "So I ask you to join me in a toast, to the new town hall, to a new era of prosperity, to community, to family." "To family," the room echoed, a chorus of polite applause filling the space. And in that precise moment, as the sound of their clapping began to fade, there was a sharp, insistent knock at the front door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a summons. Every head turned. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a sudden, tense silence. My mother shot me a panicked, angry look, as if I had willed the interruption into existence. "Who on earth could that be at this hour?" she hissed under her breath. I didn't move. I remained by the credenza, a silent statue. I knew exactly who it was. Arthur had timed the call perfectly. The knocking came again, louder this time. A guest, a junior partner, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Should someone—" Before anyone could move, the door swung open. A young woman stood on the threshold. She was dressed in a practical trench coat, her face sharp with intelligence and ambition. In her hands, she held a notepad and a professional camera with a large flash attachment. It was Miss Vance, the investigative reporter. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside, and the world seemed to shrink, to focus on the space between her and David. Click flash. The camera flash was a miniature bolt of lightning, stark and brutal. It bleached the color from the room, momentarily illuminating every strained smile and widened eye. David flinched as if struck, his hand flying up to shield his face. "David Pierce?" Mistress Vance's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "My name is Sarah Vance. I'm a reporter with the Chronicle. I have a few questions for you about the town hall contract." The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. The air crackled, thick with unspoken questions and sudden fear. Mr. Henderson, the councilman, looked as though he'd swallowed a fishbone. The drugs, the shock, the sudden public challenge. It was the perfect storm, and it hit them with the force of a hurricane. David's face, already pale, turned a ghastly shade of white. The confident host vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. I have no comment," he stammered, his words thick and clumsy. "This is a private party. You need to leave. Now." But Mistress Vance took another step forward, her gaze unwavering. "I have documents suggesting significant irregularities in the bidding process. Kickbacks funneled through a series of shell corporations. A company called North Stream Ventures, for example. Does that name ring a bell?" It was a name from my grandmother's diary. David's carefully constructed world was visibly fracturing, but it was my mother who shattered it completely. The tea had transformed her anxiety into a rabid, protective hysteria. She leaped to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "You can't talk to him!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. She pointed a trembling finger at the reporter. "You have no right. He's a good man, a wonderful man." She was trying to defend him, to build a wall of virtue around him. But in her drug-fueled terror, she grabbed the wrong bricks. She reached for the darkest secret of the house and hurled it like a shield. "He has done everything for this family," she screamed, her eyes wild. "He took care of us when no one else would. He took care of everything. He even took care of Chloe's mistake." The words hung in the air, glittering with poison. Chloe's mistake. The room was utterly still. "Mrs." Davies's mouth hung open. Mr. Henderson looked from my mother to me, a dawning, horrified comprehension on his face. My mother had just confessed, in her frantic attempt to prove David's goodness by highlighting his role in managing my shame. She had laid the entire truth bare for everyone to see. She had told them there was a mistake. She had told them there was a secret ugly enough to require David's saintly intervention. The confession, unintended and absolute, was the final push David needed to fall into the abyss. Seeing his life's work, his reputation, his freedom, all crumbling before his eyes, he broke. The last vestiges of control snapped. A raw, guttural scream ripped from his throat. "Lies!" he roared, his face contorted into a grotesque caricature of rage. "It's all lies! A conspiracy!" He lunged, not at my mother, not at me, but at the reporter. He lunged across the table, knocking over glasses of wine that spread like bloodstains on the white linen tablecloth. He was no longer the town benefactor. He was a wild thing, all bared teeth and flailing limbs. "I'll kill you! You won't ruin me!" One of the business partners jumped up and grabbed his arm, but David threw him off with surprising strength. The room erupted into chaos. Women screamed. Men shouted. Mr. Henderson was already backing towards the door, his face ashen. It was a full-blown public meltdown, a confession painted not in words, but in pure, animalistic violence. And I stood by the door, perfectly still. I hadn't moved. I hadn't said a word. In my hand, I held a slim manila folder. Inside were the copies of my grandmother's diary pages, the irrefutable proof. But I didn't need them now. They had done the work for me. I watched the beautiful facade of our family, the gilded cage I had lived in my entire life, burn to the ground in a glorious, terrifying inferno of their own making. And for the first time, the smoke didn't choke me. It smelled like freedom. The chaos swirled into a vortex of flashing blue and red lights that painted the walls of the dining room in frantic, strobing colors. The guests, David's esteemed partners and allies, had scrambled away like roaches in the light, their horrified whispers and hasty apologies echoing in the foyer as they fled. They didn't want to be splattered by the shrapnel of his implosion. Ms. Vance, the reporter, had been faster and smarter than any of them. The moment David lunged, she had sidestepped with the grace of a matador, her camera capturing his raging, contorted face. Her call to the police, Arthur had told me, was made moments before she knocked on our door. She hadn't come for an interview. She had come to witness a detonation. 2 uniformed officers entered the house, their expressions grim and professional. They took in the scene with practiced calm. The overturned chairs, the shattered glass, my mother sobbing hysterically in a corner, and David, still muttering about conspiracies, his tailored suit now rumpled and stained with wine. "David Pierce?" one of the officers said, his voice a calm, authoritative anchor in the swirling madness. "You need to come with us." David's raving subsided into a low, venomous hiss. "You can't. You have no idea who I am." "Oh, I think we're starting to get a pretty clear picture," the officer replied, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click, as they locked around David's wrists, was the final, definitive sound of his downfall. It was the sound of a closing door, of a future sealed. They led him away, a man stripped of his power, his dignity, his carefully crafted fiction. He was just a criminal now, pathetic and exposed under the harsh glare of his own porch light. My mother watched him go, and a sound came out of her, a raw, wounded cry that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. She collapsed into a dining chair, her silk dress askew, her face a mask of utter ruin. The hostess of the year was now just a woman sitting in the wreckage of her life. The performance was over, and there was no applause. The reputation she had cherished more than her own daughter was a pile of ash at her feet. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with a toxic cocktail of hatred and betrayal. "You," she whispered, the word laced with venom. "This is your fault. You did this." I didn't reply. What was there to say? She was right. I did do this. I had simply held up a mirror, and they had shattered it with their own monstrous reflections. The house fell into a profound, unnatural silence, broken only by my mother's ragged sobs. The smell of stale wine and fear hung in the air. The beautiful prison was now just a crime scene, a tomb for a family that had been dead for years. And then I heard it, a soft creak from the top of the stairs. I looked up. Leo stood there, bathed in the dim light of the hallway. He must have been drawn down by the screaming, by the sirens, by the violent tremor that had shaken the foundations of our home. He was in his pajamas, his hair sleep-tousled, his face pale. He was just 16, on the cusp of manhood, but in that moment he looked like a small, lost child. He saw it all, the wreckage of the dining room, his grandmother, a broken heap. His eyes followed the path to the open front door, where the flashing lights of the police car receded down our quiet street. He had just watched the man he called his father, the man he idolized, being taken away in handcuffs. His gaze then traveled across the ruined landscape of the room and landed on me. His eyes met mine. And I braced myself. For the anger, the accusation, the hatred of a boy whose world I had just systematically dismantled. I was ready for him to scream at me, to call me a liar, to blame me just as our mother had. But there was no anger in his eyes. There was no rage. There was only a vast, deep, dawning horror. It was the look of someone waking from a lifelong dream to find themselves in an unrecognizable reality. The pieces were clicking into place behind his eyes. My mother's shrieked words, Chloe's mistake, the years of strange tension, my quiet sadness, his grandmother's obsessive devotion, his father's sudden, violent unraveling. The entire architecture of his life was a lie, and he was seeing the blueprints for the first time. He wasn't looking at his sister anymore. I don't know who he was seeing, the victim, the architect of his pain, a stranger? For the first time, he was truly seeing me, and in doing so, he was seeing the lie he had been living. The horror in his eyes was not just for the scene in front of him, it was for the 16 years behind him. A chasm opened between us, vast and silent, filled with everything that had never been said. He took a small, involuntary step back, as if the truth was a physical force pushing him away. Then, without a word, he turned and fled back into the darkness of his room, the sound of his bedroom door closing a soft, final thud in the ruined house. I stood alone in the center of the devastation. The victory I had planned for so meticulously felt cold and heavy in my chest. This wasn't the sweet relief I had imagined. It was just an ending. A quiet, barren field after a brutal harvest. I had my justice. I had my revenge. And I was more alone than I had ever been in my life. The gilded cage was broken, but I was standing in its ruins, and I wasn't sure if freedom was a place you could reach or just another word for having nothing left to lose. The silence that fell after the storm was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum, the sound of a world that had been hollowed out from the inside. In the days that followed David's arrest and Eleanor's spectacular implosion, the grand house on the hill ceased to be a home. It became a tomb, vast and echoing with a new, more immediate kind of ghost. The old specters of my childhood trauma, the whispers of abuse that had haunted the hallways for years, had been exorcised. But in their place, fresher, more violent phantoms now roamed. I saw them everywhere. I saw the ghost of David's face, contorted not with the leering secrecy of my memories, but with a raw, public fury, his mask of philanthropy torn away to reveal the feral beast beneath. I saw the ghost of Eleanor, crumpled on the expensive Persian rug, her carefully constructed world shattered into a million pieces around her, her wails echoing a despair so profound it felt like a physical entity in the room. I saw the ghosts of the guests, their faces a gallery of shock, pity, and disgust, their hurried departures a final judgment on the House of Blackwood. I had won. The word itself felt like a foreign object on my tongue, metallic and tasteless. Justice had been served, cold and brutal, exactly as I had planned. David was in custody, his assets frozen, his empire of lies crumbling under the weight of journalistic scrutiny and federal investigation. Eleanor was a wraith, confined to her bedroom, a prisoner of her own shattered mind. The victory I had fantasized about for so long, the moment of sweet, righteous vindication, had come and gone. It had tasted not of honey, but of ash. There was no elation, no soaring sense of freedom. There was only this profound, suffocating emptiness. My days fell into a strange, monotonous rhythm, a penance of my own design. I would wake in my girlhood bed to the oppressive quiet. I would walk the silent, sun-drenched halls, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the polished hardwood floors. I would go to the kitchen, the very heart of the home, now as cold and sterile as a morgue. There, I would prepare a small tray of food, a piece of toast with marmalade, a soft-boiled egg, a cup of chamomile tea, simple things a mother might prepare for a sick child. I would carry the tray up the sweeping staircase, my hands steady, my face a blank mask. I would place it on the floor outside Eleanor's closed bedroom door. I wouldn't knock. I would just leave it there, a silent offering. Then I would retreat. Hours later, I would return to find the tray exactly as I had left it, the food cold, the tea filmed over, untouched. Some days, the teacup would be overturned, a dark, spreading stain on the wood, the only sign of life, the only communication from the ghost in the master suite. I cleaned up the spills without a word. I took the tray back to the kitchen, scraped the uneaten food into the bin, and washed the dishes. Then I would wander again. I would stand in the living room where it all happened, tracing the patterns on the rug with my eyes, replaying the scene. The reporter's sharp, incisive questions, the slow creeping horror on David's face as the effects of my garden's harvest took hold. The way his carefully modulated voice had cracked, the paranoia flaring in his eyes. And Eleanor, her panicked, desperate confession, the truth spilling from her lips like a poison she could no longer contain. "It was Chloe's mistake," she had shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. In that moment, she had sealed her own fate and his, but she had also confirmed everything I already knew. To her, Leo was my mistake, my sin, my shame, not David's crime. I had destroyed them. I had taken the foundations of their lives, the lies and secrets they had built their world upon, and I had turned them to dust. I had done it to save myself, to give a voice to the child who had been silenced for so long. And the price of that salvation was this suffocating silence. It was a heavy price, heavier than I could have ever imagined. It settled over me like a shroud, and I wasn't sure if I was breathing underneath it. I had freed myself from my gilded cage, only to find myself standing in the middle of a barren, desolate field, the smoke of my scorched earth campaign stinging my eyes. The cage was gone, but so was everything else. A few weeks passed in this suspended state. I learned from a curt phone call with a social worker that Leo had been sent away. He was to live with a distant great-aunt, a name I barely recognized, in a state I had only ever seen on a map. It was for the best, they said, to give him distance, to let him heal. I wondered if they knew what he was healing from. Did they tell him the whole story, or just a sanitized, palatable version? The thought was a dull ache in my chest, another ghost to add to my collection, the ghost of the boy who had called me sister, whose life I had upended as collateral damage in my war. Then, one gray afternoon, the mail arrived. The quiet thud of letters falling through the slot in the front door was a sudden, jarring sound in the silent house. I ignored it for hours. The mail was for a family that no longer existed. It would be bills addressed to Eleanor, business junk mail for David, perhaps more legal notices from Arthur Harrison's office. I had no interest in any of it. But as dusk began to bleed through the tall windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, a flicker of something, curiosity, or maybe just a desperate need for a distraction, drew me to the door. There, on the marble floor, amidst the glossy circulars and a stark white envelope from the bank, was a single, flimsy letter. The envelope was pale blue, the kind you buy in a drugstore packet. The stamp was from another state, and the address was written in a hand I knew better than my own, yet it was different. It was shaky, the letters ill-formed, the looping C of my name looking more like a question mark. It was Leo's handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. My hands began to tremble so violently I could barely pick it up. It felt impossibly light, as if it contained nothing but air. I carried it into the living room, the one place I had been avoiding, and sat on the edge of a velvet armchair that still smelled faintly of Eleanor's perfume. For a long time I just stared at it, at my name, written by his hand. What could he possibly have to say to me? Would it be a torrent of rage? A litany of accusations? Would he call me a monster? A liar? The person who had destroyed his world? A part of me felt I deserved that. I had braced myself for it. Slowly, my fingers clumsy and stiff, I tore open the seal. The sound was like a scream in the quiet room. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, torn from a spiral notebook. The message was short. "Chloe," it began. There was no dear Chloe, no sister. Just my name. They told me some of it. The social worker and Aunt Carol. I don't think I believe them. I don't think I believe anyone anymore. Everything I thought was real wasn't. My birthday. My dad. You. My whole life feels like a story someone made up, and I was the last person to read it. I keep waiting to wake up. I don't know what to think. I don't know if I'm supposed to hate you. Aunt Carol says you did a terrible thing, but for the right reasons. That doesn't make any sense. Nothing makes sense. I'm not writing to ask you to explain. I don't think I could handle an explanation right now. I just have one question, and it's been stuck in my head since that night. I saw your face after everything. You just stood there. You didn't look happy. You didn't look sad. You looked like nothing. I stopped reading, my vision blurring. I could feel the cold tile of the foyer under my feet on that night, the chaos swirling around me, and the profound, absolute numbness that had settled deep in my bones. He had seen it. He had seen right through me. I forced my eyes back to the page. The final sentence was just 4 words, standing alone at the bottom of the page. Were you ever happy? The question was not an arrow. It was a drill. It bored straight through the layers of numbness, through the guilt, through the ghostly silence, and pierced something deep inside me, something I thought had died long ago. It was a shard of glass in my heart. Were you ever happy? It was such a simple question. And I had no answer. In that moment, staring at his childish scrawl, I realized that in all my years in that house, in all the conversations, the arguments, the tears, the forced smiles, not one person, not my mother, not my uncle, not a single soul, had ever once thought to ask me that. They had asked me to be quiet. They had asked me to be good. They had asked me to be invisible. They had asked me to bear an impossible burden. But no one had ever considered my happiness. The letter was not one of forgiveness, and it was not one of condemnation. It was something far more powerful. It was a recognition. It was the first time someone in my fractured, shattered family had acknowledged my pain, my existence, my feelings. It was a fragile, trembling hand reaching out across the void. Tears I didn't know I had left began to fall, fat and hot, onto the letter. They smeared the ink of his question, blurring the words until they were unreadable. I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall. I clutched the thin piece of paper to my chest as if it were a lifeline. I didn't write back. What could I say? The truth was no. The truth was, I couldn't remember the last time I had felt a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. But I couldn't write that to him. Not yet. So I folded the letter carefully, the paper now soft and warped from my tears, and I tucked it away inside my grandmother's locket, which I had taken to wearing again. It rested there, against my skin, a question without an answer. A fragile seed of something that might, one day, find a way to grow in the barren, poisoned soil of our family. That letter was the catalyst. It was the crack in the dam of my inertia. The question, "Were you ever happy?" echoed in the silent house, and the answer screamed back from every corner. No, not here. I would never be happy here. This house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a mausoleum, a monument to pain, and I was its ghostly caretaker. I couldn't heal in a tomb. The next morning, I called Arthur Harrison. My voice was hoarse when he answered, but it was steady. "Mr. Harrison," I said, "I want to sell it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The house?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Everything," I said. "The house, the furniture, the cars, all of it. I can't stay here." "I understand, Chloe," he said, and the simple validation in his voice was a balm. "We can begin the process immediately. There are some things we need to discuss first." He came to the house the following day. It was the first guest I'd had since the disastrous party. He didn't look at the house with pity or morbid curiosity. He looked at me. He sat across from me at the massive dining room table, a leather briefcase open before him, and he explained the situation in calm, practical terms. With David's criminal case proceeding and all his assets frozen, and with Eleanor having been declared legally incompetent by court-appointed doctors after her breakdown, the control of the entire Blackwood estate, by default, fell to me. The sole remaining, legally sound heir. It was the final, bitter irony. The family fortune, the very thing Eleanor had worshipped and used as a weapon against me, was now mine. It felt less like a victory and more like a lead weight. "Your grandmother was a very clever woman, Chloe," Arthur said, pulling out a separate, much older file. "She suspected David's moral and financial instability. Years ago, she set up an independent trust for you. It was to be yours on your 30th birthday, or in the event of what she called a catastrophic family failure. I believe this qualifies." He slid a document across the table. It was a trust, completely separate from the family's main accounts, funded by her own personal inheritance. It wasn't a vast fortune, but it was substantial. It was enough. It was a final gift from beyond the grave, a key to a door I didn't even know existed. My grandmother, the woman of quiet gardens and knowing smiles, had been planning my escape long before I was. The weeks that followed were a blur of logistics. Real estate agents in sharp suits walked through the silent rooms, their voices too loud, their assessments of good bones and market potential feeling like violations. Appraisers came to tag the furniture, the art, the silver. Strangers wandered through my past, putting a price tag on my memories. I moved through it all like a sleepwalker, signing papers where Arthur told me to sign, nodding at suggestions I barely heard. My only task was to pack. I went to my room and found a single, small suitcase. I opened my closet, filled with clothes Eleanor had bought for me, clothes that felt like a costume. I took a few pairs of jeans, some simple shirts, a warm sweater. I packed the clothes on my back. Then I went to my nightstand. I picked up my grandmother's diary, its leather cover worn smooth with age and secrets. I took Leo's letter, still folded inside the locket, the diary, the letter. My history, my weapons, my survival. I put them in the suitcase. I looked around the room, at the books, the photographs, the trinkets of a life that was never really mine. And I closed the door, leaving it all behind. I left it all to be sold, to be scattered, to be erased. The day the sale closed was bright and cold. The house was empty, stripped of all its finery. It was just a shell, its ghosts finally quieted by the sheer emptiness. I did one last walkthrough. I stood in the doorway of Leo's room, now just a box with bare walls. I stood in the living room, where the indentations of the furniture were still visible on the rug, like scars. I walked out the front door and did not look back. Arthur drove me to a used car lot on the edge of town. With a portion of my grandmother's trust, I bought a simple, reliable sedan. It wasn't new, it wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The keys felt solid and real in my hand. We shook hands in the parking lot. "Where will you go?" he asked, his eyes kind. "I don't know yet," I said, and for the first time, the not knowing didn't feel terrifying. It felt open. Just away. "The road is a good place to start," he said with a sad, knowing smile. "Call me if you need anything, Chloe, anything at all." I got into the car. The engine turned over with a reassuring rumble. I put my single suitcase in the back. On the empty passenger seat, I placed the 3 things I had saved from the wreckage: the silver locket, glinting in the afternoon sun, the worn leather diary, the folded, tear-stained letter from Leo. They weren't symbols of my pain anymore. They were my map. They were my proof. They were the story of how I had survived. I pulled out of the lot and onto the main road, the one that led out of Harmony Creek. I drove through the town I had known my entire life, past the park where I had pushed Leo on the swings, past the library where my grandmother had taught me to love stories, past the street that led to David's opulent office. It all looked like a movie set now, props from a life I was leaving behind. As I reached the edge of town, the familiar green sign came into view. "You are now leaving Harmony Creek. Come back soon." I glanced at it in my rearview mirror,
watching it get smaller and smaller until it was just a green speck, and then it was gone. I fixed my eyes on the road ahead. The highway stretched out before me, a long gray ribbon disappearing into the horizon, an unknown future. I reached over, and my fingers brushed against the locket on the passenger seat. I thought of Leo's question. Were you ever happy? No, not yet. A small, unfamiliar feeling fluttered in my chest. It wasn't happiness. It was lighter than that. It was the feeling of a massive weight being lifted, the first breath of clean air after years in a sealed room. For the first time since I was a small child, hiding from the monsters in the dark, I was free. And in the vast, quiet space of my new car, on that open road, I began to understand. Freedom wasn't a destination. It wasn't a feeling of victory or joy. It was just this, the beginning of the road. What do you think is the first thing a person does when they are truly free for the first time? Let me know in the comments below.